Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. This is going to be a really great show because I actually have two good friends of mine on tonight, and they are, they are Nick Braña and Karen Bernal. How are you guys doing tonight?
Great.
Pretty good.
Yes. So Nick Braña is the founder, well, let me just say he's the founder and the director of a movement for a People's Party, formerly called Draft Bernie for People's Party. And Nick is also the former national political outreach coordinator with Bernie 2016. So he was on the campaign staff, and the former electoral manager with Our Revolution, which is the organization that Bernie started. And full disclosure, I was actually on the initial steering committee of the Draft Bernie movement, and I dropped out after a couple of months, mostly because I was not pulling my weight and I felt really guilty. So I will say that I support the effort to start a People's Party. Now, Karen is a three-term chair of the California Democratic Party's Progressive Caucus, as well as a member of the party's executive board. She is also an appointed member of the Sacramento County Democratic Party and co-founder of the Wellstone Progressive Democrats of Sacramento County. And I also served with Karen as a delegate for Bernie at the convention in Philadelphia. Karen was the chair of our California delegation. We decided that we were not happy with the appointment of Jerry Brown as our chair, so we were going to elect our own officers, and Karen was our chair, and she led us, and we had great meetings every morning in Philadelphia, and we led some of the opposition that you might have seen on the convention floor. So the subject of tonight's show is, can the Democratic Party be reformed, or should we start a new People's Party? So I can't think of any better people to speak to about this than these two, because Karen also just wrote a report called Autopsy, the Democratic Party in Crisis. And she revealed this about 2 weeks ago. She wrote this with Norman Solomon, and they went to Washington to introduce this. And we're going to talk about what was in it and how it was received. And then a week later, Nick rebranded the Draft Bernie campaign into the Movement for the People's Party, of course, because Bernie never accepted their invitation, and they had gotten so large and so popular that they decided they were going to go ahead and start the People's Party anyway. So we're going to talk more about that, but the first question I have is for you, Karen, and that is, tell us what possessed you to write this autopsy, and then what are the main points in it? What is the takeaway? It's a 33-page report, which I read, and I'm going to post the link in the comments. But what possessed you to work on it, and what are the main recommendations?
Well, what possessed us to work on it was the fact that this is the first time in many years that the party has not done an autopsy on its last presidential election. Prior to that, it was pretty common. And for 2016, they decided not to. And I think a lot of people can guess at why that was. We felt that it was very important to do one. And we understood that within the context of the fact that the establishment Democrats did not want to talk about what had happened and why it happened. And so we decided that we would have to do it. If no one else did, we were going to do it. And it didn't look like anyone else was going to do it. And so we did that. We covered a wide range of topics at first. We had various iterations, including sections such as populism in the party, the base in the party, and so on. What we ended up with was 8 sections: corporate power in the party, race in the party, young people, voter participation, social movements, war, democracy, and the party in the future. And we kind of, with those 2 sections that I just mentioned, they came to be absorbed in other sections that we have now. And we felt that it was important to do this because even if it is, even if they don't, if they decide to ignore it, this needs to be a record that it can be said that we tried, we went out there and we wrote this. And yes, we did go have a few meetings in DC about it.
Okay, so can you talk about the recommendations, specifically about, not reaching women, not reaching rural voters, not reaching, just what did you find? What was the autopsy? What did the Democratic Party do wrong?
Oh my gosh, I'm not sure what it did right. Okay, I want to answer your question. Recommendations. In the first place, we've got a massive issue coming up, and for this, it doesn't even matter what party you're in, but we've got a massive issue of voter disenfranchisement that was at play in the primary and in the general election. And it will be in play in 2018 and in 2020. And if that is not prioritized by the party, we're going to see some nightmarish scenes during those elections, because a lot of people were purged from polls. There is voter ID laws now in effect, and all of these things. This is a matter of democracy. It's not even about caring about what particular party, but it's a matter of democracy. Also, we mentioned that they need to commit themselves to adhering to its own charter, which they violated, to be even-handed in the presidential nomination process. As well, the superdelegate system, it has to be abolished. And also now we are at a time in the political landscape where we are operating in social movements, in the context of social movements. And if the party cannot understand that and embrace that, then they are doomed. And then what's more, this is not just about voter turnout, but it's about energizing the base as well as expanding the base and universe, by, standing up for policies that are class conscious and very aware of the social movements on the ground.
Yeah, you mentioned that it's not that they had a white working class problem, that they had a working class problem. And you included, people of color and women who have not made gains under, our neoliberal system. Now, regarding social movements.
Can I just say one thing very quickly?
Sure.
Okay, just so that we know, the working class will be primarily people of color across the board from 17 to 54 by 2032. If we take only that one section that voted overwhelmingly for Bernie in the primary, 17 to 27, that will happen in 2021, just 1 year after the presidential election. So this idea of silo politicking and pitting identities against each other has got to be thrown out. And what's more, these two universes are becoming intersectional, whether we do anything about it or not.
Yeah, that's right. And, I learned a little bit from reading this report, because I've been saying that identity politics is dividing the left and everybody's in their own issue silos. But you make it very clear that we can do both. We can talk about us as the 99% and have our economic issues, but we also have to talk about these different identity issues, and we can do both. And the Democratic Party isn't doing both. Now, I want to let Nick jump in here before I ask some more specific questions about your autopsy, because I pulled out some points that resonated especially with me as a person who's active in social movements. And you too were involved with Occupy, Karen.
Yeah.
So we both have a history with social movements. But I wanted to ask Nick, because I know that you read this, what was your take on it?
My take is that it's fantastic. I agree with it, and I think that Karen did a great job, and so did Norman Solomon and the others who authored the report. The question for me is, how likely is it now that the DNC is going to adopt this? This is the recommendations that Karen put forward they're not novel. They've been out there for a long time. Superdelegates have been an elitist way of selecting presidential nominees for decades, ever since the 80s, since they were revived by the party.
By Tad Devine, I want to say. The person who formulated superdelegates was Tad Devine, and I never tired of saying this in the campaign when I was running Los Angeles for Bernie. But when he was asked by the Wall Street Journal about why they did that, he said, and I quote, "So a Huey Long style populist or a Norman Thomas style socialist could not get the nomination." And when I looked at Norman, what's his name? Thomas. Norman Thomas's profile on Wikipedia, it was almost identical to that of Bernie Sanders, except that he was more anti-war. So I found that interesting that, Tad Devine, who, for our viewers, in case you don't know that name, he was Bernie Sanders' media advisor and chief strategist. So go on, Nick. I just had to interject that.
No, that's good. It's a good connection. So the question that we're posing, that we posed as Draft Bernie, which, our Draft Bernie kind of phase, we found that when we went out there and advocated for a major new party and that Bernie should start it, we got an incredible outpouring of support on social media and on the ground. And we built up, so much so that we created a field organization in 47 states with chapters across the country. There's so much energy for that, and what we found that many people have come to the same conclusion that we have, that at this point, it is easier to start a new party rather than to reform the Democratic Party, because like we've talked about, like Karen talks about in the report, is these are recommendations that have been out there for a long time. And the question that we're posing as a movement is, what happens if the Democratic Party refuses to embrace them, as it has? And also, what kind of expectation do we have that the Democratic Party is going to embrace them at this point, given that in so many different ways, they're going in the opposite direction? Like, of course, they have kept the primary process very closed off. You have ridiculous dates to sign on, like the one in New York, where you have to register far ahead of time. But also, they've kept superdelegates intact. And also, you have things like removing progressive members from the DNC's national committee, the purge that happened recently. And so, one of the things that we see recently is that you have, we found out the incredible extent to which the DNC was being controlled by the Clinton campaign. It was fundraising, it was hiring, it was communications, it was all of the money raised, quote. And at the same time, we discovered that Tom Perez and the party establishment had removed progressive members, purged them from the DNC's national committee, and is not embracing changes pushed for by the Sanders representatives on the Unity Commission. And so you have a rigged primary on the one hand in 2016, rigged to a degree that it was even greater than most of us had anticipated in the Bernie campaign. I mean, it was a comprehensive level of control over the DNC. Like, the DNC was acting essentially as a subsidiary of the Clinton campaign. And on the other hand, you have a party that's refusing to reform that process whatsoever and replacing progressive members on their national committee with more corporate lobbyists from Citgo, Fox, and other financial companies, like the vice president of government relations of Goldman Sachs sits on the party's national committee. And they voted to bring in to eliminate the ban on corporate money coming to the party in February, during the chair's race. And so we look at this and we see it's not even, it's not even a question of, can the party be reformed? It's the party is going in the wrong direction. And what expectations do we have at this point that it's going to switch direction?
Okay, I want to ask Karen to respond to that, because even in your report, you talk about John Ossoff, which, okay, see, now I'm getting feedback even though we're wearing the earbuds. Okay, now I'm not getting it. Sometimes that happens. Well, So even in your report, you talk about John Ossoff, and we all during the campaign quoted Chuck Schumer's famous quote where he said, "Don't worry about going after rural voters and rural working class voters in Pennsylvania. For every rural voter we lose in rural Pennsylvania, we'll pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs, and that will be repeated in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana, or whatever the other 3 states were." And of course that actually didn't happen, because those were the exact states that they lost. So you referenced that in your report, and you think that they're still doing that, right?
I think they are. I mean, we got a meeting at the DNC, unbelievably enough. We had sent this report to quite a few people. We sent it to the Congressional Progressive Caucus, to Keith Ellison, to Bernie Sanders, and to Tom Perez. And what happened is, surprisingly, we got a meeting with Will Haler, his senior advisor. We were not able to secure a meeting, unfortunately, with Ellison or Sanders, but we did get to talk to Grijalva with the Congressional Progressive Caucus. What was interesting at the DNC was that there was obvious gatekeeping going on. We had a long meeting, but you could tell that there was definitely conceding on the part of the DNC about the kind of culture that needed to change. In fact, one of the things that I remember Mr. Haler saying was that they are systematically trying to move away from, in terms of their operations, from the consultancy class, and one that stresses actual resources, and as he said, boots on the ground in a regional-based kind of structure, which, that's all good. That's very basic and everything. But one of the things I brought up to him was still about the prioritizing of funding that the DNC has decided to continue doing, such as with Ossoff. And that was and actually in place somewhat with the Virginia race with Northam. I mean, it's great, I guess, that he pulled it off, although I find Mr. Northam way too milquetoast for me, but that's another discussion. The thing about it, though, it was that there still seemed to be an eschewing of the very base that it claims to support. In other words, prioritizing the outreach to people of color, to the young, to working class, and much more to the suburban white voters, or as they call them, the persuadables. And what we were there to tell them, in fact, we did tell them, is that the so-called persuadables are not persuadable, and that this is a losing proposition. So they're very aware of the kind of talking points from the left right now. Interestingly, Mr. Haler was he came to the position as senior advisor, I'm sure, as part of the deal for Mr. Ellison to kind of back off in his race against Perez. And Haler himself came from Keith Ellison's camp, and I understand was a supporter of Bernie. So they did make some concessions in that way. But that being said, what we're not seeing them embrace the fact that we need to have a party that embraces and comes as close as Bernie did in embracing social movements and expressing that in an electoral campaign and in a party. And I just want to say one thing to what Nick had mentioned, to piggyback off of what he said. Not only are we not seeing them not only are we seeing them go in the wrong direction, but one of the things that we've also noticed, which I also brought up at that meeting, was that we see this wave of progressive candidates coming in right now to try to step up, and whether they're running for Congress or running for state house seats. And what's been interesting has been the response from the establishment, which is to support, just like the way that the nominees came from the wealthy donor class, that we have many of these candidates who themselves were previously wealthy donors or bundlers for wealthy donors. So it is almost as though this backlash that's occurring has instead touched off this kind of, I guess, response that actually serves to sharpen the differences between the two camps within the party.
Well, I want to move into another line of questions having to do with social movements that I think both of you can answer. Karen, you with regard to the Democratic Party, and maybe Nick, you regard to the People's Party. But, excuse me, I did a show last week with about the elections, and I had on Josh Stanfield from Activate Virginia, who is a Bernie delegate who, with another Bernie delegate and some others, started this Activate Virginia group. And they focused on recruiting candidates based on local issues. And they had a pledge. And it wasn't that I'm not going to take any corporate money. It wasn't that I'm not going to take fossil fuel money. It was I am not going to take money from Dominion Energy, because that's the biggest player in the space there in Virginia. And 35 candidates took that pledge. And of that, 13 won. So that's a huge successful percentage. And even the transgender woman who won ran against Route 28. It was Fix Route 28. So it was like a hyper local issue. Right. And that's what you find with these parties now, is they're not focusing on the local issues. And Karen, you and I are here in California, where Gail McLaughlin is running NPP. She used to be the Green Party mayor of Richmond, California, and they had a slate of corporate-free candidates, as they're called, who took no money from corporations. They were able to beat back Chevron's candidates, and they call that a company town. Chevron even had a desk outside the mayor's office there. And even though they were outspent 20-1, they won because they went around door to door using people power. And you say, and I wrote this quote because it really resonates with me. A party that functions primarily during election seasons has lost the initiative in terms of ingratiating itself into the daily lives and concerns of voters.
Right.
And so, yeah. How do you imagine? Yeah, I was just going to say and put the question to the both of you. How do you imagine what does this look like for you? And let's start with California, because you're chair of the California Democratic Caucus. How are you going to take the California Democratic Party, which you have some control over, at least the progressive wing, and make them more concerned about the everyday, more involved in the everyday concerns of the voters? And then, Nick, I'm going to ask you the same question about the People's Party.
Well, I really love that question. But before I answer that, I just also want to tell you that, yes, I'm really glad that you brought up the manner which these victories are owed to in Virginia and elsewhere. Especially, let's talk about Tim Carter. We know that the reason that he won was due to a heavy influence and the hard work of DSA on the ground. And what we're talking about is number one, people power, grassroots action, but also having a long-term relationship with the communities there. And one of the things that's mentioned in that social movements in the party section is the fact that you can't come in, 3-4 months before an election and expect to be received well when you have no relationship with that community. You have to be able to be a part of that community when there isn't a vote on the line. As it relates to the inside the party stuff, well, and you mentioned Gail McLaughlin, excuse me. One of the things that we can do, we have the power of votes when it comes to endorsements. And right now there is a significant block of votes that are identified as progressive. And one of the things that we can do is to be in a very disciplined way, decisive in which way an endorsement goes. And sometimes that could mean no endorsement as well. And so when we talk about that, one way is to realize that power and not give it up so cheaply. And of course, right now, we are being, as you might imagine, heavily wooed by this candidate and that candidate to win our delegate votes for the endorsement at the February convention here in California. And it is the subject of much discussion among the progressive delegates, many of the burners that came in. And we're very well aware that the votes that we have could deliver an endorsement for this candidate or that candidate. And when it comes to perhaps outside candidates, there are strategies that we feel could be helpful in that regard on the inside. But those are the kind of things. I mean, endorsements mean something. So what we choose to decide to do with it, that's important as well.
Well, I was actually thinking more in terms of doing listening tours. Like you and I talked about, we have 80 assembly districts and the delegates doing listening tours, because it's all well and good for us to decide that we need to have single payer health care and free college. But in each community, the issues may be different. And I didn't get to finish my point because I tend to digress. So often I forget where I start out. But the point that I wanted to make about the Richmond Progressive Alliance and why it's like Activate Virginia is that they are getting these different issue groups, these different movement groups, like you were talking about in your Autopsy, Black Lives Matter movement and, immigrants' rights movement and all these different movements and prison reform. They're all coming together in these coalitions and they're working together on a year-round basis in their communities. And it put me in mind of, I'm fighting charter schools and the privatization of education through the expansion of charter schools. And a number of years ago, I covered an AFT, American Federation of Teachers, conference here in Los Angeles. They had a session called Social Movement Unionism. And the heads of like 5 major city unions were there talking about how, look, teachers have to be involved in their communities, and not just around contract negotiation time, because otherwise they're not going to get the support of the communities. And just today, someone posted that the Charter School Association are sending out what they call parent engagement officers to mingle in the community and help the community with their concerns, like they helped in Southeast Los Angeles. For decades, they've been plagued with the Exide, the pollution and the toxic contamination from the Exide battery factory. And the charter school people actually set up a meeting with the elected officials, and this is how they do it. They're like engaged in the community, and this is what the unions ought to be doing. But they're only coming around during contract negotiation time. So let me just let Nick speak because he hasn't spoken for a while. But I'm just wondering if in the People's Party you've talked about the mechanics, like once you get the party started. And we can talk about how likely it is that you will get a third party started, given the barriers. I'm going to ask you about that later. But assuming you get the party started, how do you envision the party acting differently than the other parties that are currently, that we all know and hate?
It's a great question because, and I will reinforce that last point because there was a poll that came out just last week, actually, that showed that the Democratic Party has hit the lowest popularity that it has had in the past quarter century. So its favorability is a 25-year low, amazingly, and in addition to that, you've had there's a big historic momentum in which you've had tens of millions of people over the past 15 years actually disaffiliate with it's not just the Democrats, it's also the Republicans, with both major parties, and become independents. And that's one of our arguments, is that we're saying there is a tide here. There's a big movement, and it spans many years. It's not just Bernie. Bernie was the latest manifestation of that movement, but it wasn't just him. And it's a movement that it precedes him by many years. It's a movement that has been building towards independent politics, against corporate politics, and against the parties that embody corporate politics, the Democrats and Republicans. And so to speak to how to a vision for what a party should be, I think both of you guys brought up a lot of great points. And And so the way that we envision it is as a movement party, is rather than a party that fights movements, and tries to maintain them as external, put up barriers to them, it rather embraces them. And it's an extension of the movements. That's the kind of party that we should have. And in fact, that energy that we see in all of these movements, it has become very apparent over the past year that it's not becoming institutionalized inside the Democratic Party. It's energy that's outside the Democratic Party. One of the things that happened in 2011 during the Occupy movement is that actually there was this big buildup of kind of anti-establishment energy and an upswelling of that, a surge. But I think one of the lessons from that is that we didn't institutionalize that energy into new structures, into new electoral structures specifically. And we're actually learning, I think that was a mistake. For example, in Spain, the M14 movement, which grew out of a similar economic recession as the Occupy movement here in the US, it did institutionalize. They became Podemos, now Podemos Unidos, a coalition of progressive parties. And they are actually making great headway against the establishment parties, the two parties that have dominated Spain's politics for the past 40 years. Those two parties are now falling apart and giving way to a progressive party. And so, that I think is a model. And in terms of what this party needs to be differently, it's a lot of the recommendations that Karen put forward inside the autopsy, but the Democratic Party has shown no willingness whatsoever to adopt. So, for example, the party the party should be thoroughly democratic in itself. The DNC is not democratic to any stretch of the imagination. I mean, in order to be elected chair of the DNC, leader of the organization, you don't actually have to speak to the membership. Rather, you go to the superdelegates, this elite group of DNC members, many of them lobbyists, and you have to ask them to be the leader of the party. So obviously that shouldn't be the case. Appointments to other key positions inside the party work in exactly the same way. Obviously, and you should be permitting people who are outside your party to vote, with open primaries, another thing that the party doesn't want to embrace. As also, just recently, we got confirmation from, it was from Jim Zogby, that the level of centralization inside the Democratic Party and the level of how undemocratic it is so astonishingly high that not even the DNC members, not even the corporate lobbyists on the DNC have access to the budget. The party has the audacity to tell the DNC members themselves, the supposed governing body of the party, who in its own charter, is supposed to manage the organization, the party. Right. They have the audacity to tell them, no, you don't get to see the budget of the organization. It's a sole prerogative of the chair. They can do whatever they want with the money. And, that is the level of kind of how centralized and undemocratic and how ingrained that is in the party. They actually told the DNC members, look at the FEC reports. Well, hold on a minute. We want to know our budget as an organization, as the managing members, you have to look at the FEC reports. Well, that gives them no actual role in determining the budget. They're just looking at what the money was spent on afterwards. And so it's a structure that is designed to prevent progressives really from taking power, because it's designed to be undemocratic, and all of these things would have to be different. And so to quickly cover some of the things that would be different, it would be thoroughly democratic. It would elect leaders from its membership as well. There would be the power of recall for leaders inside the party. And so if a leader takes office, isn't fulfilling his mandate, her mandate, then the voters inside the party membership can decide, you're coming back, we're putting someone in there. There is nothing like that inside the Democratic Party. And it's by design. It's not intended to work that way. It's intended to be hyper-centralized and controlled so that it can be dominated by a tiny amount of donors. Last thing I'll say is that while Karen went to the DNC, and I think it was great, they gave Karen an audience. But I think too often what the Democratic Party does for us is that they they throw us bones, you know. And so at the same time that they were speaking to Karen, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Ron Wyden were speaking to resort tycoon Stephen Klubeck, billionaire resort tycoon. And guess what they were telling him? They were giving him, quote, great signals that the party has no intention of changing and remaining a big money funded billionaire party.
Yeah. And I just want to point out, I don't know that anyone understands, I'm not going there to be a cheerleader for the party. I'm very, very surprised actually that I did get an audience. And I think the only reason that I got an audience was because it is making huge news. The report it was, you know, on national NPR. It's the cover story on The Nation magazine. Even Bill Moyers put it out. It's made a lot of Democracy Now! They understand that it's out there. I think had it not been had reached that kind of threshold, I do not think that I would have gotten an audience. Now,
wait, before you make your next point, I don't want to leave that point because this is something I wanted to ask you, and now is a good time to ask. What about the mainstream corporate media? I'm sure you had press relations people. Did you pitch this to MSNBC, CNN? You know, what about the Hillbots out there? I call them the Hillbot journalists, you know, like Joy Reid and, you know, Joan Walsh, who writes for The Nation, and Peter Dow, who's just completely crazy. But, I mean, what did those people think of it, or did they ignore it?
You know, we've had a couple of, you know, comments that were, you know, this is all the work of the Bernie bros and stuff like that. I mean, typical what you would think. That doesn't faze me at all. But as it relates to the media, we were surprised that we got an interview with national NPR. And in fact, the person that they decided to put opposite of me to talk about this was Michael Tomasky, who some people may know in New York is quite a Hillary supporter. And so that was an interesting conversation because everyone that called in basically backed the report and it, you know, expressed their extreme displeasure with the party. And so I think that the party has a problem, and the problem is it doesn't know how to change. The problem is it is alienating its own base. And Nick brought up a point before about that the party registration has been at an all-time low. To put numbers to that, it's actually tied with the Republicans at 28%. They don't even owe a majority of the electorate. And this this went down from the spring when they were actually at 30%, and at the people identifying as independents right now sits anywhere between 40 and 42. But we are tied literally a year into the Trump presidency with the Republican Party, and that speaks volumes. And then the other thing that I found in doing this report, which I thought was just amazing, was that with Trump on the ticket, there is now no mistaking what the choices were. Still, 8% of the under 30 vote went to a third party candidate. So that's 8%, which is extremely high in a general election to reach that number. And here's the other part that's even more telling, is that in the all-important battleground states where it counted even more, that number for the under 30 vote was much, much higher. So what we have is a situation here where the party is losing its future base. And yet, because of the fact that they are beholden to corporate power, beholden to a wealthy donor class calling the shots, they do not seem to have the wherewithal to be able to make the deep structural changes that are necessary. And for these changes to occur, they must be structural. It can be no other way.
Let me ask you if this is like a chicken and the egg situation, because one of the things that came out in Donna Brazil's book and Nomiki Konst did some good reporting on it, which was how much they spend on these very expensive consultants and law firms like Perkins Coie. And these people are very invested in being the ones to give the advice. Because if they lose control of the advice, and they lose the money. Right. And so if they're the ones telling the Democratic leadership what they should be doing, and it's very self-interested, you know, how are they ever going to hear other voices, especially if they're not going to listen to people like you? So let me pivot for a second to Bernie Sanders, okay? Because we all worked on the Bernie Sanders campaign, and we now see that Bernie is the most popular politician in America. And Karen, you told me earlier, you think, I asked Karen, just so the viewers know, why did Bernie, like a lot of people are getting pissed off, including me, that Bernie keeps repeating the deep state propaganda that Russia, you know, interfered in our election. And yet he refuses to discuss the DNC rigging because they repeatedly ask him. And, you know, someone I spoke to today said, I prefer to focus on the issues. But as we've discussed, it is an issue. Clean and fair elections is an issue. So if he's not focusing on that, you know, someone said to me, oh, it's probably because he doesn't want to seem like sour grapes. And you said, Karen, you think it's because he's running. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, listen, if he doesn't have to worry about the framing of this, I think he would be much, much more open about it. I think that what he's trying to do is when he says he wants to talk about the issues, that to me is a tell that he is going to run again, and that he has to be in campaign mode. He is in campaign mode, and I think I don't let's say fault him for trying to be tight with his messaging. What I think he has to realize, though, is that this voter disenfranchisement, this is a democracy issue, and this can be addressed in a way that doesn't, as they say, relitigate. I'm sick and tired of hearing about that word, but it doesn't relitigate, as they say, the past. It's completely possible to talk about this from the standpoint of these new voter ID laws that are in place. And yes, what happened and with some of the purges that took place, without even going to what happened to him. Do I think that he should be able to talk about that? Absolutely, because everyone else wants to hear it. But if he chooses to, it's a mistake, I believe, to choose to ignore it, because people are angry about it, and it is an issue no matter what party we're talking about. There's plenty of people that, for the minor parties, that this is a huge issue as well.
And I'll tell you, he will lose support, because I know a lot of people, you know, not only in Nick's movement, but in other movements that are just really pissed at him about that. And also the DNC fraud lawsuit, you know, that the Becks did, that he never really acknowledged that. But I want to ask a more pointed question. Why do you think, okay, Karen, if you think he's running as a Democrat, which I do think he is, I think he has a very outmoded idea about third parties.
Lauren, let me respond to what Karen just said, actually.
Okay, but don't let me forget my question. I'll write it down.
Because I think it is so important, you know, because in my mind, how can we as progressives support a party that simultaneously admits to having rigged the primary, says in open court that it views itself as a private corporation, is not accountable to its own charter, and rather than accepting responsibility for rigging the primary, says no, it's our right to rig the primaries, because you know we can effectively pick candidates in back rooms if we want to, you know, and kind of so the primary in that sense takes on more of the form of a facade rather than being a legitimate process of selecting a candidate. So how is it that that anyone can ask working people, you know, who don't have just great wealth, who don't have so many resources, who have very limited time, you know, these people who we're trying to help, and who how can we ask those people to give their time, their energy, and devote themselves in the way that they did to Bernie's campaign in 2016, knowing that the process is stacked, knowing that the process is rigged inside that party. I mean, this is very serious. I think that we need to really understand that we cannot ask people to do that under those conditions. And
I'd like to answer the question.
And well,
was
okay,
that a question?
Yeah, I know. I'm wondering.
Okay, sure.
Were you asking me?
Oh, yeah. Well, I would love to hear the answer.
I think it was rhetorical, but why don't you answer?
Oh, okay. No, I'm sorry to interrupt then.
I
thought it was a question.
And but I would like to hear the answer. I mean, people on the campaign, I read a number of letters that that people sent us. People gave money from their Social Security checks. People skipped family funerals to volunteer for Bernie, to kind of do GOTV in a state right before a primary date came up. So, we're talking about very serious contributions that people made. And in retrospect, we really know that the outcome of that primary had been stacked all the way back in early 2015. And so how is it that, so I would love to hear, Karen, you talk about that. Is it how can such a party in its right mind ask people to devote, to devote resources and to actually work towards progressives in those conditions, knowing that you're really operating in a system where the outcome is predetermined, like in 2016?
Well, I think Karen agrees with you, and she's basically saying that this is the reform that needs to be made. So I want to get back to my question about Bernie, because
I'd like to answer it though. I mean, hold on for a minute, okay? I think a lot of people on the outside.
I've lost control of my show, folks. Go on.
I mean, a question is being asked of me. I would like to answer it, and so, the party and the people that have gone on the inside to make this fight are not the same thing. I think you need to make sure to acknowledge that first off. And I hate to bring up this irony because it's a bitter irony for all of us. But the fact of the matter is, in Bernie's loss, right now, the way the political climate that we're operating in social movements, he was able to advance that to a place where it is now quite muscular and able to be an actual threat. And that was only because he ran as a Democrat. He took it from 2% to a photo finish. Okay. Now here's the thing. It's a bitter pill for us to swallow, because now he is the most popular politician in the country. And that would not have happened had he not been able to go for that ride. Does that mean that I believe in the Democratic Party? No, it doesn't. What we are trying to say here, though, is that, like the Republican Party, it is a direct avenue to power. And if you have, and I totally believe that without the social movements, without the movements on the outside pushing, because parties do not bring change at all. They simply respond to change. It is the movements on the outside that creates those conditions. Okay? The people on the inside have to facilitate part of this takedown. They have to be able, and while they're doing it, by the way, here's the thing. It's like I say, if you go to a crappy movie, or you see a crappy play, you read a crappy book, and you're suddenly now in the second to the last chapter, or the second to the last play, the last 10 minutes, and you say, wow, this is really sucking. What should you do? Walk out at that moment, or go, I stuck around for the last 10 minutes, and I can tell you all, I did everything that we could, and it sucked. Okay? There's a part of it that is about that. Another part, and I suspect that that's part of what Bernie is doing as well. And then there's this other part, that those of us who came from Occupy, and I was in the anti-war movement prior to that, I was at Crawford for weeks and so on, and this has been my background. We are not politically trained. We do not understand what political organization looks like. and how that operates in bureaucracy like a party, any party. And this is valuable training. And then again, this is something that they can take another skill set, because just like Occupy informed the political lexicon that we now employ at the drop of a hat, the 1% and the 99%, we had to go through that in order to get to where we are right now. So I do not think, for me, looking at this isn't about saving the Democratic Party, but about just being able to advance however we can by any means necessary. And I support, by the way, the formation of many parties, of a third party out there, because why? It's good for democracy.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to get to my question about Bernie, and then I want to take some questions from the viewers. Now, my question about Bernie is this, and I'm going to preface it, and hopefully I won't digress again. But my preface is, oh, now I've forgotten the preface. Let's see, we're talking about Occupy. Okay, so the Occupy movement changed. It was a social movement that changed the conversation, that made a Bernie Sanders candidacy possible. And these are the two most important movements of my life. And I came to them late in my life, okay, in the last 10 years. And I'm going to be 60 on Thursday. Happy birthday to me.
Happy birthday.
Anyway, so they were the most important movements of my life, because I see them as umbrella movements, omnibus movements, if you will, that cover all of our issues. And Occupy was not a failure to me because it changed the conversation, and it explicitly did not have leaders. But if it had a leader, Bernie Sanders would be the one. Now, I went to the Left Forum in 2015, and I heard Winnie Wong and Charles Lenchner from People for Bernie speaking about something that really resonated with me. They said, in politics, you have your consumer, your entrepreneurial activists, and you have your consumer activists. Your entrepreneurial activists were people like me that organize about fighting fracking, fighting the TPP, fighting for net neutrality, sort of the issue activists. And your consumer activists are the ones that come out every 4 years and get involved in a campaign. And he said that that's what People for Bernie was going to do. It was going to merge those two types of activists. And that really resonated with me. And that's why I started LA for Bernie. And that's what I tried to do. And even when Kevin Zeese, my friend from popularresistance.org, works with Margaret Flowers, said, "Oh, Lauren, I knew you were just part of the Democratic Party, because he's a Green, and you're just getting people to vote for Bernie, who's sheep herding people into the Democratic Party, only to ask them to vote for Hillary." And I said, well, you know what? Bernie's a man of his word. If he had to run as a Democrat and he had to say he would endorse the eventual nominee, then he's going to do what he said he was going to do. But I don't care, because my goal in this is to bring all these consumer activists into my issue fights. And I think that's what the Bernie movement has been able to do. And we see it right here in California, Karen, with SB 562. So many of the Bernie-crats and the Hillary, Kimberly Ellis supporters are now fighting for single payer here in California. But my question is, why, if Bernie is running for president as a Democrat, and I think he is, why would he refuse to meet with you? Number one. And then after you answer that question, Nick, why do you think he rebuffed your effort to get him to head the People's Party? So Karen first.
Well, let's face it, I'm to the left of Bernie. I'm just going to say that first off. We caused a lot of problems for them in Philadelphia. We, as you know, Lauren, we were on the floor and we brought the heat. And I know that, there is that memory of that. But that being said, I don't believe that it was necessarily that he refused to see me so much as part of it is, what does this have to do with him? I can tell you about a phone call that I had with someone that was kind of a gatekeeper. And it's interesting because these people that we really love, such as Ellison, such as Bernie, they're perhaps surrounded by the toughest, I would say, gatekeepers out of all of them. there. And one of the things that I was told is that, well, everyone's an expert, but what does this have to do with Bernie? This is actually what I was asked on the phone. And I said to the person, well, here's an example. Right now he's going around and he's giving these speeches for Medicare for All. He's touring the country. He's talking about, he even came to San Francisco. And I said, I loved seeing Bernie in San Francisco, but why isn't he going to historically Black colleges in the South? That's an example of what I'm talking about. And so he had nothing to say again as a comeback. But my point is that this about the Democratic Party, this has to be viewed as a pipeline to power, and to recognize that if we don't have people on the outside, even at least to help, eventually bring it down, if it looks like it has to be brought down, because right now the evidence points that way, but there has to be some resistance and fighting there as well as there is on the outside. And this is what Bernie has been doing. And so that doesn't make everyone loyal to the status quo or what the party is right now. It just, they very well understand that they have to get inside that door. And if it's to put a turd in a punch bowl, then that's what it is. That's part of it, But the other part of it is that you've got to be able to have a ticket to that dance to be able to bring that issue there, and that's what Bernie is doing. Now,
wait, we only have a few minutes, so let me let Nick come in and answer the question. I want to know, why do you think he rebuffed your effort to start a third party? Do you think it's because his bad experience with third parties in the 70s where he got 1%, 2%, and 3%, or do you think it's because he simply knows how difficult it is, the obstacles that the major parties put against starting a third party in this country?
Well, there's a number of things that Karen said that I want to respond to first, since I have been able to speak for a little while. And so first of all is that Karen referenced a series of steps to take power. And I think that's exactly what we're looking at. So to go back to when the Republican Party replaced the Whig Party in the 1850s, it began with the election of 1852, where the party elite and the party establishment of the Whig Party approved a pro-slavery platform. Now, what happened in response to that was that instead of saying, all right, let's just kind of try to continue fighting inside the party and make the party force the party to take, an abolitionist stance, rather, the abolitionists who were the base, who were the large majority inside the Whig Party, got together and said, no, we're going to create an institution. We are the majority. What is this? Why are we fighting over an organization that doesn't want us, that's so unpopular? Let's instead form a competing organization, the Republican Party, and indeed that's what they did. And in just a couple of years, they had taken a large foothold in the House of Representatives. In 4 years, they had taken Congress, and in 6 years, they had taken the presidency and Congress. And so, it was the conditions that allowed that to happen. It was the conditions of a party that had abandoned its base, and that was rather, the elite was dictating to the base. And we have those conditions once again in the United States, where the party has abandoned its base. The overwhelming majority of progressives support progressive policies that Bernie stood for. The overwhelming majority of the country supports it, let alone the overwhelming majority of Democrats. That's why Bernie's the most popular politician in the country. And so I think of it, I agree. Bernie made the right decision to run as a Democrat in 2016. That was the right decision. But it's the series of steps, and each step brings us to the next thing. So even though in Occupy, we didn't form a party out of that, it raised consciousness in the United States, elevated inequality to an issue of public discussion. It brought us to the point where we could have a Bernie campaign that was that successful, galvanized,
that's right,
and then prove the resistance that we were going to encounter inside the Democratic Party. Okay, but the next step in our view, is now that the Bernie campaign has brought us to the point where we can even be independent of the establishment parties, the Democratic Republican Party institutions themselves. And so that's what we have the opportunity to do. And it's this historic opportunity. And part of what I'll mention in addition to that is that Bernie and Trump, Bernie is the most popular politician in the country, has been trying to reform the Democratic Party, has been trying to, open it up, bring millions of people into the Democratic Party, as he often says. And then Trump on the other side, as one of the most offensive presidents in modern history, the most offensive, racist, homophobic, sexist, and in a lot of ways, militaristic and autocratic. If those two forces should be growing the Democratic Party as the opposition party tremendously. There should be a surge, the most popular politician and one of the most despised, undemocratic politicians, in history, both essentially are forces that should be pushing people into the Democratic Party. Instead, like Karen pointed out, it's not. And so there is a direction, and it's this direction that is towards independent politics. Independents are the large plurality, like Karen pointed out, and the number of Americans who are now calling for a major third party has reached a record high. It's 61%. 2 out of 3 Americans is calling for a major new party. Another thing that Karen said that I thought was great, she talked about the way that the party was essentially mortgaging its future with millennials. And there were amazing polls taken during the 2016 election, showed 91% of voters under 29 in 2016 wanted a major third party candidate. And so that is the future, and that's overwhelming. I mean, that's almost unanimous. And so I think that what the time has come for us to do as progressives is that rather than fighting the current, this is something that we should embrace. Rather than fighting that progressive and that populist current outside of the parties that have for so long failed to represent working people and sided with corporations and Wall Street instead we should embrace that movement. And we should go with it. We should swim with the current and do what the large majority of people are telling us. Because as we kind of confront this question of how is it that we motivate Americans to vote, how is it that we reinvigorate the American political process? Well, I think it's not rocket science. I think the American people are telling us what they want us to do. And they're saying we don't have confidence in either of the establishment parties to represent us anymore or to change even. And we want something brand new.
Yeah.
All right. What about a third alternative? What about if we do?
Can I just say that I agree with everything Nick said. I mean, I have for years. But the thing about this is that what I find that what is the redeeming feature of coming into the Democratic Party like the way that Bernie did. I'm not so sure that Bernie is trying to get people to join the Democratic Party so much as he understands that it is a tool that he has there available, and that's what he's going to do. For me, I think it all goes back to understanding what political organizing looks like, and the party serves, even if it's for a 2-year term as a delegate, it is definitely a boot camp, as it were. And as social activists on the outside, we never lose that. I mean, I still come from the streets, but I understand how what political organizing looks like in a way now that I feel that is a skill set that social activists need to understand, particularly because we are operating in a very hostile environment. One of them, for instance, is the Electoral College, and that is a huge impediment to us. So, I mean, understanding how to work in a political environment is important. And I don't have any hope, really. I do think though that it has lessons to teach.
Well, let me just say one final point, and I'd like your comments on it because we've already gone long, but we have a pretty big audience still sticking with us. So I think we can go for a few minutes longer. And my question is this, or I should say my view as I've come to it, over the past year is that we need to be local. I don't even want to think about the presidential election anymore. I think we should be organizing all year round, like you talk about in your report, based on news, and we need to be doing that with alliances with local groups, and we need to be very strategic and start with local offices. I mean, after all, that's what the Republicans did. You know, they started with school board, they started with city council, and in our case, you know, all our candidates want to run for, you know, governor. And I should say, I'm working for someone who still wants to start with governor. So, you know, wants to run for governor, wants to run for Senate, wants to run for president. You know, it's like we have to, I think what the victories of last week show us is that when we are hyper local and we form coalitions, like look how many of these candidates were Socialist Alternative, were Democratic Socialists of America, were Our Revolution. And they all fought, even Lee Carter, even though the Democratic Party opposed Lee Carter because he said they shouldn't be taking corporate money. He was opposed to the pipelines. You know, even though they opposed him, organs of the Democratic Party came in to support him at the end, whether it was Planned Parenthood, whether it was Indivisible, and he was able to win. And that's the kind of coalition or popular front politics that they practice in Europe. So that's my prescription for what progressives ought to be doing going forward. And I was wondering what you two have to say about that.
Well, I mean, I mean, one of the sections of my report, and it's actually the one that I wrote outright, the social movements in the party speak to that. You know, the main thing is any party, but in this case, particularly the Democratic Party, they cannot see social movements as a tool to get Democrats elected, and that social movements have to be embraced and appreciated as the rising tide that lifts all boats, right? And that is they have to become part of a social movement, and that is a huge mistake that the Democrats constantly, and this has been happening for years, that you can always see the co-optation that occurs. And I'll also say, in many ways, the top of leadership and of many labor unions, we're not, again, talking about rank and file power, or the kind of, the unionism where rank and file have a voice in its democratic processes. But a lot of these unions with a top-down business model who are tied at the hips to the leadership of the Democratic Party, for instance, came in during the Occupy movement, and if you recall, and they wanted us to stop using the words Occupy and saying, 99% spring or something like that. Yeah. It was the attempt at rebranding and co-opting that occurred, and this happens typically in political parties. And so when you see that happening, you as the social justice street activists that we are, that you have to stop it and fight it, and then push back on this. And then that's your job. We're not there to be cheerleaders. That's your job. Your job is to actually be truthful.
Or you co-opt it, like my video, Activist Guide to Co-opting Indivisible. Let George Soros and Priorities USA fund the resistance, which they make no bones that they're doing, right. And let them hire all the people at the national level to set up the 6,000 chapters that they have all over the country. And then we infiltrate them because, quite frankly, there's a lot of good people in there that are new to our movement that were kind of asleep during the Obama years. They thought he was great. And now they're just horrified that Trump is in office and they're joining the resistance, which to them is indivisible. And yet, I was asked at our panel last week at the Left Forum, Karen, somebody from a local indivisible group said, we would like you to speak to our indivisible group. So that's exactly what we need to be doing, because they want to do more than just saying no. They want to be for a positive program as well.
Well, what we have to understand is up until that moment, they were largely apolitical. And so this is their first entree for many people into something that they consider a movement. And if we know better, we have to open their eyes. We have to open their eyes to things that aren't these top-down, one-directional kind of move-on type of organization. Yes, we need to radicalize them, in other words.
I think that I think Karen made some great points about, and I see them historically applied to the Democratic Party too, to the institution, and that's the co-optation that happens of progressive movements time after time after time after time. It's really it's a cycle. Many people who get engaged, or who are kind of invigorated and awoken to politics for the first time by a movement like Bernie's, may not be aware of that history of the way in which the party has dealt with progressive candidates, going back to George McGovern, from when they abandoned him, all the way through the way Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, millions of people who were activated there in an effort to take over the party, and all the social movements that have come since then, and progressive candidates like Dennis Kucinich that have come since then. And so the defining feature of the Democratic Party is not that zero progressives can get elected in it. It's that it maintains the status quo. Really, it's not designed to prevent no progressives from getting in, but it's designed as a whole to prevent progressives from taking it over, or to prevent it from switching away from a corporate-funded status quo. And so, yes, there are candidates that can make it through, but the overall character of the party doesn't change, and it hasn't for decades. And that's what this is about. That's kind of what we're trying to do with Movement for a People's Party, is say, wait a minute, let's look around, before we dive into trying to change the party once again. It's like, let's look at the history that others have had in doing that. In recent history, the experience with Bernie in the past year and on the campaign. And let's learn from that. This is an opportunity to not follow what has become a well-worn path for progressive movements, which is trying to work inside a party institution which is designed and dedicated to take over, nullify, and block and turn progressives away, and really tamp down progressive movements and lower their standards as well. And so by forcing, for example, progressives to support a candidate who's running for party chair, because of the structure of the Democratic Party, it being the superdelegates that elect the party chair, Keith Ellison, a progressive by any definition, who's someone who supported Bernie Sanders, the first congressional member to support him. But actually, Keith Ellison, what we see, this is what happens. You go into the Democratic Party, you try to climb to the leadership of the Democratic Party. A month after announcing his candidacy, he had endorsed a billionaire in Florida for party chair. And 1 month later, by January, he had reneged on his pledge to take corporate money out of the party. And this isn't because he believed any of those things. It's because the institution forced him to do that. It forced him to become something that he wasn't, just like it forces all of us to become something that we aren't, because it's a filter that prevents us from really expressing who we are as progressives. And this is our opportunity to break that cycle.
I just want to say I agree with Nick here. And I just want to say that one thing that hasn't been brought up in history here, I see a lot of people are bringing up history. We are coming now full circle from the time that RFK tried to run before he was assassinated with his Black-Blue coalition, which was when he tried to put together a coalition of then, yes, the white working class. It's going to be no more here soon, folks, but the white working class with civil rights activists in the Black community. And what happened is that was the coalition that he wanted to put together with an anti-war agenda. And then, he was assassinated, and that never came to fruition. So the party, and we can talk about, what stopped that. Would be a great conversation. But the party has a very bad history of doing that. Now, what's happened is that, you know, they continue to lose the base. People are not stupid. The technology allows them to educate themselves at the same time, and the young people are not going to go for it. So the onus is on the party as to whether or not they're going to do something. But regardless of what the party does, it is important for democracy that there are other movements and parties that come to the fore, because that's huge.
Okay, I've got to end the show because it's been an hour and 15 minutes, and people are going to watch this afterwards, and it's very hard to ask somebody to watch something longer than an hour and 15 minutes, no matter how fascinating it is.
I'll say quickly, Lauren, that I think that that's a question that all progressives need to pose, to themselves at this point, is where do we draw the line? You know, how far do we have to go inside the Democratic Party? How much do we have to see?
Okay, Nick, I got it. I'm not letting you have the last word on this, okay?
I will say,
oh my God.
Yourselves. Be trained. Be trained.
I'm dropping you two out of the broadcast if you don't let me close this show, okay?
Go for it.
So this is a conversation that we can continue. You're both extremely smart. You're very knowledgeable. You have the history. I love history. I was a history major. I would love to have you both back to continue. This is obviously going to be an ongoing dialogue. We'll see where we are a year from now, heading into the election of 2020, how far the People's Party has come, how far Karen has come in reforming the Democratic Party. I mean, my God, we can't even get single payer here, even though we have a 2/3 majority. So we've got a lot of work to do. And like we said in Occupy, it's all about diversity of tactics. I'm not going to tell anybody that their way is better than the other person's way, because I think what we have to do, and this is how I always end my show. Well, actually, I end my show by promoting the next show, which is going to be up at the California Democratic Party e-board meeting this week. And I don't know exactly when I'm going to be live streaming, but I will be live streaming. So now, as I always end my show, I'm going to tell the viewers to keep fighting.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren.